All right, we're going to talk about sanding and sanding efficiently. Many of you at this point have all the pieces of your candy dispenser cut out. In fact, some of you have even gone a couple steps further than what you see here, in that you may have bored the hole in your top piece, and you may also have the notch cut out in your slider. So many of you at this point need to pull up a chair at a workbench, grab a couple pieces of scrap sandpaper, and start sanding. Now, it's important to understand some of the steps involved in sanding efficiently. You need to understand that you're going to start with a coarse grit sandpaper, and in our instance, we're going to use 120 grit. This is not the coarsest sandpaper that you can get. However, we're working with a softer pine material on our candy dispenser project, so 120 can often be coarse enough for our applications. After we work with some coarse grit sandpaper, we're going to go to a medium grit. And what I've set out for you folks to work on is 150. Now, this isn't going to be the last step in sanding. We are going to go as far as 220 grit sandpaper, but I'm not ready to get that out at all because I want to make sure that you folks are spending enough time sanding your projects efficiently so that you have a good, effective sanding effort before you go to assemble and possibly even finish your candy dispenser. So what I'm going to need first is 120 grit. That's going to be the coarser sandpaper. 150 is going to be a bit finer. That's going to be medium grit. The smaller the number, the coarser the grit. You can find sandpaper as coarse as 20 grit. That is almost gravel. It's very rough. The coarser it is, the more aggressive it is in moving the wood fibers. Now here I have just a quarter sheet of sandpaper. What I do is I'll take a full sheet of sandpaper, I'll fold it in quarters and rip it into pieces, because really all you need is some small scraps to work with. Now, as you're sanding, starting with the 120 grit sandpaper, you want to make sure that you're going with the grain of the wood. If you go against the grain of the wood, all you're really going to do is you're going to scratch up your piece and make it look terrible. Make sure all sanding is going with the grain of the wood on all edges. And I would estimate that you're going to, on your smaller pieces, you're going to spend 5 to 10 minutes sanding those. On your larger pieces, you need to put in 10 to 15 minutes sanding those. Now, things you're going to be looking at as you're sanding, first off, these pencil marks, you don't need those on there anymore. Spend some time getting those removed from your project. That's not something you're going to want to see once you've completed your project. Sand off all pen and pencil marks. Take the time, and you can see as I'm sanding on these, it's taking a little bit of elbow grease to even get those to budge. So this is going to take a little bit of work. The other thing that you have to look at is your mill marks on the edge from sawing. If you can run your fingernail across that and you feel that it's coarse, you need to keep sanding that until it gets much smoother. You're going to need to do that on all the edges, and you're going to need to spend quite a bit of time doing it. So like I mentioned already, grab a stool, pull up to a workbench, and get comfortable, because this is going to take time. Realistically, if you're working with 120 grit sandpaper, you got your 5 pieces here, I would think that that's going to take you a class period. Now, once you've spent a good deal of time removing all your imperfections, then you will move on to this medium grit. The only purpose of the medium grit sandpaper is to remove all the scratch marks that are left behind from the 120 grit sandpaper. So 120 is to remove all the blemishes. It's very aggressive. It's going to take off a lot of fibers, wood fibers. 150 is simply to smooth out all the marks that the 120 left behind. I could see if you're just starting to sand, taking a whole period using 120. If you get through 120, all your blemishes are off, all your pencil marks are off, then it's probably not even going to take a half a period to use the 150. But you want to sand these real thoroughly. You want them to look good. If we have time, we'll apply a finish. If they're not sanded good, that's really going to show up in the finish, whether or not you've taken the time to sand. Now, probably after a period and a half of sanding, I'm going to set out some fine sandpaper, like some 220. It'll say 220 on the back, not 120, not 150, and you'll spend a few minutes using that. So 120 is going to take the longest. Plan on it taking about a class period. Now, if you're concerned about removing your initials, I do have some letter stamps. They actually will indent your initials in your project for you. It's a little more permanent, kind of adds a signature for you, and I'll show you those at another time. So I hope this helps you develop a good understanding of efficient sanding. You want to make sure that you're doing it effectively so that your project will look good in the long run. So until next time, good luck.